Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal, the founder, co-director of the co-founder and director of the Petrarch Institute. I'm here with my friend and colleague here at the Petrarch Institute, Dr. Miles Smith. You want to say hello?
Hello, everybody. Great to have you here. Alex, we're gathered as part of our fairly frequent conversations on issues relevant to classical learning. Today we're talking about a topic that makes a good run-up to one of our upcoming courses. Is that something you want to tell people about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a few courses that we're having in mind. The most immediate one is a course on these two seminal figures of Nietzsche and Socrates, right, who Alan Bloom talked about as sort of the two alternatives. Socrates, the rationalist, ethicist, against Nietzsche, the advocate of the passions and so forth. Anyway, I'm oversimplifying some very complex issues, but I think these are two of the most interesting figures that you can find in the philosophical tradition, and both have a lot to say on the classical world and the classical ethos. So is there anything else that you were thinking about, Miles, in terms of that course?
Well, I guess just in terms of context for today, we've done some podcasts in the past, which are available on YouTube, and if all of you have not watched them yet, you're welcome to do so through our site, or you'll find them also on our Twitter account. But we have talked about the idea, which is natural when you're looking at classical ages and classical learning, of the Golden Age, periods in which much that we rely upon as the rudiments of our civilization were founded, was put in place. And so we've explored in the past, Alex, the idea of the Axial Age, and we're going to revisit that theme today. Did you want to tell people how that fits in and what we want to talk about today?
Sure. So in our we've had sort of a running series on the Axial Age, and in our first installment, which was these first three installments we were discussing the Axial Age, which was a concept in Karl Jasper's, this period between 800 BC and 200 BC, when so many of the world's spiritual and intellectual traditions, and really the foundations of the various world civilizations, or at least some of the most significant world civilizations, took hold. And we discussed the various traditions of Asia, Asia in the broad traditional sense that includes the Middle East, right, as Western Asia, starting with this idea of the scholars, the mystics, and the prophets, and we focused a lot on the Confucian culture of China, the mystical religions which arise out of Asia, of Hinduism and Buddhism, and the Hebrew tradition of ancient Israel, which is the biblical tradition, which is of course the root not only of modern Judaism, but also of modern Christianity, which of course for that reason had a huge influence on the development of the West. So today I want to turn to ancient Greece. And this is really going to be three installments because the Greek achievement, I think we could say, was so multifaceted. And it's also sort of a lot of what we focus on at the Petrarch Institute. So I thought it would be good to compartmentalize it into these three traditional categories of the poets, the statesmen, and the philosophers. And we'll start today by talking about the poets. But at first, I think it would be a good idea to sort of situate Greece in terms of what we have discussed so far. What can we say about the Greek achievement? Probably a lot we could say, but one thing that one notices is that virtually all of the world's religions, right, including Judaism and Christianity, did not arise in Europe, right? I mean, so the Greek achievement was not primarily a religious in the realm of religion, although Greek concepts and thought certainly played an important role in the development of religion in the West. What was the Greek achievement? Well, Christopher Dawson, the British historian, wrote as follows. He said, "It is from the Greeks that we derive all that is most distinctive in Western as opposed to Oriental culture. Our science and philosophy, our literature and art, our political thought, and our conceptions of law and free political institutions. The European ideal of liberty was born in the fateful days of the Persian War, when the navies of Greece and Asia met in the Bay of Salamis, and when the victorious Greeks raised their altar to Zeus, the giver of freedom, after the Battle of Plataea." Right? So we have this idea, on the one hand, this was the point at which we could say, even the terms Europe and Asia, right? This was the point at which we could say there was first a conception of Europe as being something distinct from Asia, but it's also from the Greeks that so much of our political, intellectual, artistic, scientific, and mathematical inheritance is derived. And again, I think these three, to some degree, we can put science and mathematics under the philosophers. I think these three categories of the poets, statesmen, and philosophers are sort of useful headings, if we're not too slavish about it, for compartmentalizing the Greek achievement. Now, you'll notice that Dawson also talked about this idea of the European idea of man. I think that this is what we could say was specific to the Greeks, right? Was this conception of man, or we could say the ideal of humanism, was born in Greece, right? What the Romans would call humanitas, and what the Greeks called paideia. And what was this ideal of humanism? I mean, I think you could see from just that sketch that the Greeks had a very multifaceted approach to achievement, right? My favorite definition comes from the German classicist Werner Jaeger, that I'll rely on for some of these notions, right? So he says that paideia is the process of educating man to his true form, right? I think an analogy we could use is, think of the Greek sculpture, the Greek sculptors who produce, say, the Riace bronzes, or the Discobolus, or the Aphrodite of Milo, right? So we have this idea of the perfection of the human form, working toward the perfection of the human form from sort of the crude materials that one is given, right, in bronze or marble or whatever it is. Paideia is the same concept applied to the realm of the soul, right? It is the conscious cultivation of human faculties, molding man toward this ideal. Right, and so one of the things that I want to discuss today, therefore, is what is the role of poetry in Greek paideia? Because Jaeger makes two important points about poetry. One is it is that the origin of Greek paideia. It is the first paideia, right? Later on, the rhetors and the philosophers would have their own alterations, or what they saw as advancements and refinements of the idea of paideia. But it begins with poetry. It begins with Homer, the first great author of Europe, essentially, right? Of Homer, who Plato calls the educator of Greece, the teacher or the educator of Greece. And I think this is very important, the fact that Plato views him this way, because as Jaeger says, right, there's two elements of the Greek view of poetry. I mean, one thing you have to realize, they had a very exalted view of poetry. It's not like today where they can barely earn a living. The closest category that one could think of in the Hebrew world was the prophet, right? I mean, Homer and the epic tradition begins with the invocation of the gods, right? The gods are speaking through the poet, so there's kind of a divine idea. But Jaeger talks about two functions of poetry. One function is aesthetic, right? And the Greeks, as we know, had a deeply refined aesthetic sense, right? That one could see, in works like the Parthenon, the Temple of Hephaestus, and so forth, right? Which the historians Palmer and Colton talked about. Basically the rational order imprinted on the raw materials of nature, right? I mean, the rational order of the human mind, and just they had a very multifaceted and very profound aesthetic sense, which is something that Nietzsche discusses very much. But the part that I would emphasize today, and that I think Jaeger emphasizes, is the educational value of poetry. That is to say, the fact that poetry, like gymnastic, right? Gymnastic, one could see as similar to the sculptor in the sense of the perfection of the bodily form, right? The Greek paideia originally consisted of these two elements, of the gymnastic, which is perfecting the human body, and poetry, which is meant to perfect the human soul. And to get a little bit into how one could think about poetry in its educational sense, in its paideia humanistic sense, I think it might be a good idea to turn in a moment to epic poetry, right? So Aristotle has this threefold division of epic poetry, which are the long narratives like Homer and Hesiod, lyric poetry, which was multifaceted. I mean, you have everything, the love poetry of Sappho and the Pindar's hymns to the Olympic victors, and you had the dithyrambics to Dionysus, which Aristotle says the roots of tragedy, right? We won't discuss lyric poetry. It was called lyric because of the lyre. We won't discuss that too much. But then there is the dramatic poetry. So those three categories, epic, lyric, and dramatic, are how they were traditionally characterized. And so I think we'll probably start by discussing epic poetry, particularly in the sort of instructive role relative to the Greek ideal. Did you have any thoughts or questions or comments you wanted to bring up, Mas?
Just on behalf of the audience, any difference in those three strains, epic, lyric, and dramatic, in terms of the emphasis of, on the one hand, this aesthetic priority or purpose that's served, and on the other hand, the moral or the formative, the educational purpose of paideia?
Yeah, no, so it's a good question. I think that Nietzsche's probably right that dramatic poetry the Greek drama was in some sense the culmination of many different elements of Greek art, right? Because you have within it this aesthetic experience that included the musical, the poetic, the visual, and the plot and the representations of the action and so forth. So in some sense, I do think that that had an enormous importance, but I don't think one can say discount either of the other two. First of all, Homer, like I said, is called by Plato the educator of Greece, and it has an enormous, he has such an enormous importance that Plato takes aim at him in the Republic, right? Precisely because he was this sort of lionized figure, and so he's sort of the figure that comes under challenge. He's the traditional figure, and so epic, and the influence of epic poetry, of Homer's epic poetry, not just on Greece, but on Roman and modern Western literature, is just enormous. You just think of Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, right? I mean, it just there's just a huge influence of Homer. The other thing I would say is let's not discount lyric poetry either. Two important poets, Solon and Tyrtaeus, are both considered sort of the formative influences on the modes of education of, let's say not the modes of education, but at least, Solon and Tyrtaeus of Athens and Sparta respectively. And so they're sort of formative influences on those two cities. So I would also give importance to all of them. So I think that they all play an important role. And if we were missing any of them, something would be missing in our overall conception. But maybe I should turn now to Homer a little bit, no?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so like I said, Homer, just an enormous, Homer's the name we give to the supposedly blind seer. I don't know how he's dated exactly, around 750 BC. And he is supposedly this blind Ionian bard-like figure, And the influence of these two epics, which are the first examples of European literature that we have, but nonetheless set a very high standard for all that came after. It was just a constant influence on Western literature through the ages, right? The epic that I'm going to focus on right now with a few passages and ideas from it is the Iliad, which, for those who don't know, basically tells the story of the last few weeks, the last few weeks of the Trojan War was supposedly had gone on for 10 years. Basic story is that Paris has the Trojan prince has kidnapped Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. Christopher Marlowe had the famous line of the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium, who was, unfortunately for the Trojans, the wife of King Menelaus, who was the brother of King Agamemnon, who was the king of all the Greeks, right? So as a result of this kidnapping, the Greek ships land on the shores of Troy and establish their beachhead. And in the weeks that are focused on in the Iliad, right, just toward the end of the war, of the last year of the war, so a dispute has broken out between the king of the Greeks, Agamemnon, and the leading hero who embodies all the heroic traits of the people of the time, and Achilles refuses to fight anymore for Agamemnon. He's been affronted, and the Trojans, under their noble leader Hector, are now driving the Greeks back to their ships and threatening the complete destruction of the Greek armies that have come for this purpose, right? And basically, Achilles stays out of it because of his anger at Agamemnon until his best friend Patroclus takes up the armor, Achilles' famous armor. He has a face-to-face fight with Hector. He's killed, and as a result, Achilles comes back to the battle and kills Hector in a climactic battle before and it ends with the funerals of Patroclus and Hector, which also foreshadow in some sense the death of Achilles. So that's the plot in a nutshell. But of course, telling you the plot doesn't describe the richness, of course, of the epic. Now, I think one of the things that some of the things that are important to discuss in terms of this notion of paideia and of Homer as being the first educator is this notion that Jaeger talks about of the Greek heroes as furnishing sort of paradigma, right? The paradigms of human conduct, right? And it served, these would be poems that represented at this point sort of the nobility of possibly a somewhat earlier era to Homer, of the Mycenaean era. And these would be poems that would sort of embody the ideals of this time. And these were ideals that, even as the Greeks grew more intellectual, we could say, and more refined and so forth, continued to exercise a great deal of influence. Now, one of the passages that that I think is important in this regard is, right, so there's a confrontation between the character of Glaucus, who is fighting for the Trojans, and the Greek hero Diomedes, right? Diomedes asks Glaucus his lineage, and Glaucus answers. He says, "Hippolochus begat me. I claim to be his son, and he sent me to Troy with strict instructions, ever to excel, to do better than others, and to bring glory to your forebears, who indeed are very great. This is my ancestry. This is the blood I am proud to inherit." Right. So this idea, ever to excel, right, ein aristoen, which is the motto of a number of universities in Britain and the United States, and so expresses one basic Greek ideal, which is this ideal of oddity, of excellence, right? That one must strive to excellence, and that the high lineage, let's say, of the Homeric nobility is not so much a license as a call to responsibility to live up to the greatness of their lineage. And another aspect of this is what we see in Homer that Nietzsche discusses a lot in Homer's Contest, this constant competition to excel, right, to do better than others, right? So this driving notion of excellence, and it's the same basic word, right, that oddity, that later in the Philosophers is used in reference to the development of the moral and the intellectual virtues, right? And so that's a notion that Jaeger talks about as well, the notion of, we could say, sort of noblesse oblige, that with the high lineage of the Homeric nobility comes a great responsibility to excel. And of course, this is at the root, in a sense, of the whole story, because what Agamemnon has done by his insults to Achilles is deny him the honor to which his excellence is due, right? This is a very important part of the value system of the time. And so it's basically unforgivable, right? So when Odysseus comes to bring him gifts on behalf of Agamemnon, please come and help the Greeks, Agamemnon makes clear that he has no price, right? The affront is not something that can be paid back with money and gifts, right? The loss of honor. So this close connection, we could say, between oddity or excellence and honor is very much part of the value system. Another idea that comes back quite a bit is later in the Iliad. So this is actually at the moment when Odysseus was bearing these gifts. So he tells Achilles tells Odysseus as follows. He says, "For my mother Thetis, the goddess of silver feet, tells me I carry two sorts of destiny besought toward the day of my death. Either if I stay here and fight beside the city of the Trojans, my return home is gone, but my glory shall be everlasting. But if I return home to the beloved land of my fathers, the excellence of my glory is gone. But there will be a long life left for me, and my end in death will not come quickly." So we have this idea, right? Achilles knows that he has two possible destinies. He can live a long life without honor, without glory, right? Without, in some sense, achieving the excellence of which he's capable on the terms of the society in which he's living, or he could live a short life of glory, right? And something you find in Aristotle talks about all the time is he constantly makes the distinction between living and living well, right? And so we have this idea that the worth of life is in how one lives and not merely in the fact of life, right? So Socrates makes this argument also. He appeals explicitly to these passages in Achilles, in Homer, for why he should not be deterred by the fear of death, but should keep to his station, keep to his post, right? Do what he ought to do. And so this is obviously a moment of temptation for Achilles, right? He's tempted to just return home because the homecoming had such a great importance as well, right? I mean, it's something that the heroes are constantly thinking of, their homecoming. In fact, it's the entire theme of the Odyssey, right? He's tempted to return home, but he chooses to stay knowing he will die, right? So it's this choice of living with the highest oddity, right? Rather than merely choosing a longer life of comfort, but without honor and excellence. So I think that was kind of important. Another passage in the Iliad that, and so I think that we're seeing here, I mean, the very fact that people like Socrates would cite this notion, right, much later, just shows the educational importance of this, right, the educational importance of Homer, right, that it would be referred back to by these figures. Okay, so another passage I think is very important is what I think is one of the most beautiful passages, right? So Priam, so Achilles, this is at the end, I think it's book 24. So Achilles has slain Hector, the son of King Priam, right? The noble prince Hector has been slain by Achilles in the climactic battle of the story, and Achilles is dragging the body on his chariot, right? Basically abusing the body, which had a very bad significance in the culture of the time, right? To dishonor the body, and King Priam comes to the camp, right? He sneaks to the camp, and he comes to Achilles to beg for the body of his son. And remember that the wrath of Achilles, first at Agamemnon and then at Hector for slaying his friend, is basically one of the basic themes of the whole story. And then Achilles greets him as follows. He says, "How could you dare to come," this is in the Lattimore translation, "how could you dare to come alone to the ships of the Achaeans," that is the Greeks, "and before my eyes, when I am one who have killed in such number such brave sons of yours? The heart in you is iron. Come then and sit down upon this chair, and you and I will even let our sorrows lie still in the heart for all our grieving. There's not any advantage to be won from grim lamentation. Such is the way the gods spun life for unfortunate mortals, that we live in unhappiness." Right? So I think this is kind of a very interesting, it's sort of, in some sense, I think the climactic scene, because the point at which the wrath of Achilles kind of dies, right? What's interesting is you have these two extraordinarily noble characters, Priam and Achilles, gifted with all that the world can give, right, in strength and power and wealth and so forth, right, and heroism and all these sorts of traits, and yet what finally unites them is the solidarity in suffering, right? What finally transcends. So it's the sense of the universality of human suffering, which kind of brings them together in some sort of solidarity that transcends the hatreds of the war, and finally appeases the wrath of Achilles, as Achilles thinks of his own father, who he uses as the example of someone who had all these gifts and yet suffered and would suffer more, because Achilles would now surely, having slain Hector, never return. Such was his fate, which I think really gives one an opening into the whole notion of the tragic sensibility of the Greeks, and this big theme in Nietzsche, right, is the whole notion of human suffering and the tragic spirit. And Aristotle spoke about, he said that even in adversity, nobility shines through when a man endures repeated and severe misfortunes with patience, not owing to insensibility, but from generosity and greatness of soul. So we have this idea of how does one deal with the suffering that comes to all, right, no matter how high and noble their place in the world. So I don't know, Miles, did you have any thoughts or comments on that? I think I pretty much covered what I want to cover in Epic.
Yeah, that's a great overview, Alex, and a very helpful one for people, I think. And my only question at this point is really one that looks ahead to our course, in which we look at these two pivotal and also clearly distinguished figures of Socrates and Nietzsche. And I just heard, as you talk about the sort of tragic theme in Homer and in that poetic form in general, this note of prudence or caution or very sober learning. So I guess in terms of the aesthetic and the moral in teaching coming together in these Greek poetic forms, if you wanted to say something about the balance between perfectibility and caution, because on the one hand the Greeks revered aesthetic perfection and human perfection through gymnastics, through idealized forms, and in the pursuit of ever excelling standards, as mentioned at the outset of your bit on the Iliad. But there's also this idea that the wisdom coming through the gods is one in which perfectibility is presumably limited by the fact that the human vision is colored by tragic realities. So did you have anything to say about the balance between those two in the kind of aesthetic and moral vision of Homer and others?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point. So a couple of thoughts that I have. I mean, one is right. So Aristotle, I mean, you don't have the sort of emphasis on humility that one gets from the biblical and perhaps especially the Christian traditions in the Greeks, but there is a lot of discussion of hubris, which is a key theme that I mean is I would say certainly implicit in the Iliad. And quite explicit in the dramatic forms, right? So I mean, Aristotle talks about the tragic flaw, right? I mean, so that a properly constructed tragedy would be one with a very noble hero, but one who has a flaw. And I think we see that in Achilles, right? There's an overweening aspect to his sort of pride, which nearly brings the whole Greek expedition to ruin. So there's this over-surpassing. It's talked about also in Diomedes at points. And so for Aristotle, the megalosouchos, which I think is, I mean, is talked about by Jaeger as being a descendant, really, of the Homeric ethos, in some sense, right? This great-souled man who embodies all the virtues. But he can only embody that to the degree he has a proper estimate of himself, right? So to have a greater estimate of oneself than one's deserts would be to exceed the mean, right? And that is the problem of hubris. But I think we're going to see, you know, with the tragedy, there is this tension between man's proper place and, you know, what Nietzsche talks about as well is this titanic urge to overcome our you know, to overcome our place, right? To aspire to a higher station than what belongs to us, and this sort of thing. So that tension is definitely there. I thought I would just segue into dramatic poetry, into Greek drama. I'm hoping to have, I mean, my specialization is in Greek philosophy, well, not necessarily Greek philosophy, I'm a PhD in philosophy, but I mean, we're hoping to have a course taught by people in Greek drama, so those who are more interested in drama and going into the details, I just wanted to let you know that in advance. So the Greek tragedy, I mean, I think we already see some of these themes already in Homer, right? You know, there's the notion that Aristotle talks about of the tragic hero, who is someone who's higher than the average man, and yet does not escape the suffering lot of humanity, right? So there's something about the universality of suffering. One of the pivotal figures, the first pivotal figure probably would be Aeschylus. And his great trilogy, the trilogy is really another invention, is really said to be an invention of Aeschylus, is the story of the homecoming of Agamemnon, which turns out not to be all that, as they say. Right, so so as Agamemnon has been away, Clytemnestra has had an adulterous relationship with Aegisthus, and when Agamemnon returns, he is murdered. We have to remember that Agamemnon slew his own daughter, Iphigenia, as part of the price for being able to go forward to Troy. So there's this curse on the Atreides line, which is played out in the course of the Oresteia, and then in the libation bearers, right? So Orestes and Electra now have to avenge their father by slaying their mother. And then the Furies in the third act, the Eumenides pursue Orestes, right? Because he needs to be punished for the crime of matricide, right? So we have this sort of self-destruction, the sort of curse that goes down generation to generation of this family, which is also given all these gifts. And I thought it was an interesting historical anecdote that Robert Kennedy spoke of the famous Pathos Mathos line in I think it's spoken by the chorus in the Agamemnon, right? He who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, and in our own despair against our will comes wisdom to us. right? I thought it was kind of interesting because, I mean, some people think of the, I mean, this is just sort of anecdotal, but, you know, to our main theme, but some people think of the Kennedys as kind of that type of political family where, you know, gifted with extraordinary wealth and power, but at the same time with extraordinary tragedy, seemingly intergenerationally. And it was interesting to me that Robert Kennedy took solace in Aeschylus. In that sense. So we have this interesting idea that, okay, there's the universality of suffering. How does one cope with it, right? That is really the test, right? What does one learn from one's suffering? As you sort of alluded to, right, we have the themes like in Prometheus Bound, of Aeschylus' Prometheus Bound, right? The theme of hubris. We don't, unfortunately, have Prometheus Unbound, so we're not 100% sure how it may end. But as it is, right, I mean, Prometheus, who steals the fire from the gods and gives it to man. So Prometheus is the benefactor of humanity, but he's also committed an act of hubris by transgressing the limits, right, of the gods with his titanic will, and is given the horrible fate of being chained and having his liver bitten out and all this sort of thing. So, and he's immortal, so he can't die. We do have this, right, again, this idea of hubris, right, of the overweening pride of man, or of, in this case, of a Titan, who has exceeded his station. But at the same time, I mean, Nietzsche makes the comparison, I guess, to the Adam story. Or we could even make the comparison to the Lucifer story, right? In the case of Lucifer, it's all evil, right? I mean, there's the pride of Lucifer in the biblical narrative, which is basically an evil character. Prometheus is a noble character. He's trying to be a benefactor, right? But he has not held to his station in some sense. So now another theme, if we look to Sophocles, is of course one of the pivotal tragedians as well, and it's something Hegel talks about as far as the importance of tragedy, is this idea of the conflict of values, right? So Antigone's brother has been executed for, let's say he's died as a traitor, he's died as a traitor, and so Antigone you know, feels the responsibility to bury her, but it's illegal to bury traitors, right? So we have this conflict between the law and her familial obligation, right? And that's an important element of tragedy as well. And I think you could see it, I mean, like Palmer and Colton said, right? I mean, the Greeks sort of shaped the forms of the Western literary mind, right? So we see the same things in the early modern tragedies. I mean, think of a play like Julius Caesar. It's about Brutus and the choice between patriotism toward Rome, his felt choice toward patriotism toward Rome, and his friendship to Julius. So the tragic conflicts in life are not choices between good and evil, or clearly seeing good and evil, which are often easy to resolve, but choices between conflicting goods or conflicting evils that are inescapable. Right. So I mean, Orestes is another good example, right? If he has the choice of participating in matricide or leaving his father unavenged, right? Which is similar in a certain way to Hamlet as well, right? I mean, so I think we see these themes echoing through the centuries, and you know, another idea that I think is important. Another idea that's important would be the notion of fate, which was a very important idea in the Greek imagination, right? So, I mean, one of the best examples of this, I think, is Oedipus, right? He has this horrible fate to marry his mother and slay his father, only without knowing it, right? And when the father Laius hears about this prophecy that he's going to be killed by his own son, he tries to kill the child. But his very act of doing that is what sets forth the chain of events that ultimately leads to him being killed by his son. In other words, the very effort to escape fate is what caused it. Reinhold Niebuhr used this example about, with respect to the great powers before World War II, that their very effort to escape the fate of war led them to war. The very decisions that they made in hope of escaping war was what led them to the war, right? So you know, it's a modern allusion to this feature that of the inescapability of fate. This is something which was probably challenged a bit with the coming, many centuries later, with the coming of Christianity, which was not fully on board with this notion of fate and destiny. And another, but I mean, it's still an idea that we use all the time today, right? I mean, what is a fate and destiny? These are concepts that are brought up all the time. Another idea that I think is quite important is, you know, the theme of the Oresteia. We have the taming of the Furies, of blood revenge into the system of natural law, of rational law. Right, so it ends with the establishment of the courts of the Areopagus and so forth. Right, so the old law of blood revenge gives way to a rule of law, which I think is kind of a segue into the way in which statesmanship and the way in which statesmen mold societies according to principles of reason and virtue in the Greek understanding, which is also an element of paideia, which we can discuss more next time. Did you have any other thoughts on that, Miles?
Really just one that looks ahead. We're doing a short little series here on the Axial Age as it touches Greece. You've shown quite capably in today's talk, Alex, how a lot of these components, especially rising out of poetry, have long lineage or long descent. You know, whether it's words that echo through Bobby Kennedy or in the mottos of universities, or the fact that the Greek dramatic arts are seen reflected in Shakespeare and things like that, with an eye to the forming of an age, with an eye to the themes that we're going to look at in the coming podcasts. Does the moral and aesthetic vision that we've been talking about in respect to the poets today have a generative effect on statesmen, the politics of Greece, and the philosophers?
Oh yeah, no, there's no question about that. In fact, I think, like I alluded to very briefly, the great lawgiver, we could say, of Athens was Solon, who was himself also a poet. And the poet Tertius was the poet who really embodied the sort of, we would say certainly today, militaristic ethos of the Spartans, right? But his poetry is all celebrating that sort of militaristic ethos. And I think the distant ancestor of all of it really is Homer, right? I mean, you could see the way Homer's oddity ethos could be taken in one way by a militaristic society like Sparta, and could be developed into a more intellectual aesthetic approach by the Athenians, right? Homer provides kind of a base that can be developed in a number of different ways, which is why Plato refers to him as sort of the educator of Greece. But yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, we could think of the poets and the statesmen as both being sort of molders. In some cases, they were the same people, right? Molders of the societies, albeit with somewhat different dispositions, right? So I think that is very much that is very much evidence. You know, it's interesting to think about in modern societies to what degree is that the case. You know, to what degree are the great writers of a society, like their great statesmen, sort of the kin in molding a culture, right? You know, in some sense. And think of think of Abraham Lincoln, for example, certainly a figure who was a brilliant writer in some sense, right? You know, so I think there's a lot of overlap between the literary and the political. So I guess we'll probably close it out now. So the next one will be on the statesmen. We'll talk about the statesmen of Greece and their contributions, and we'll try to relate it to the broader trajectory of Greek culture. And don't forget, October 19th. Have I mentioned that yet?
Absolutely. We look forward to seeing people in the upcoming installments of this podcast series, and we certainly welcome anyone who would like to join us as a student in our course on Socrates and Nietzsche.
Very good, Miles. Okay, everyone, take care, and see you next time.